Please listen carefully.
Welcome to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast from CityWorks Expo. My name is Brad Stevens, and I'll be your host today, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to our guest, Charles or Chuck Marohn, the founder and president of Strong Towns. How are you doing today?
Doing fantastic. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you, and I have to say again, thank you for such a sweet audio sound we're getting from you. It's always nice to have somebody on the other end that has a setup.
Yeah, we run our own podcast, so I've got a little studio here, and sound is one of those things that I obsess over too. So yeah, it's good when it works.
Well, and I've been lucky enough. For those of you that don't know, CityWorks is housed within a co-working space as our kind of parent company here, and I run the co-working space, and so we happen to have a recording studio, which makes my life really easy when we do this. So, but Charles, well, go ahead.
I was going to say I'm an old drummer in a band. I was in junior high and high school and all that. I was the drummer, and so you're around all this sound equipment, but you always get the junky stuff because who cares what the snare drum sounds like? So yeah, I've always kind of had this obsession, like how do we get it to sound just a little bit better? Yeah.
Well, I appreciate it. So this our listeners are getting a rare treat today. But you've been doing Strong Towns since 2008, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, I started writing in November of 2008.
So that, that's you've got quite a catalog of stuff there, and you've been engaged in this work, I think, even before then. But I wonder, kind of, how do you define what it is that you do?
Well, what we do right now is way different than in 2008, and that's been a process of learning. What we're interested in doing now is changing our culture, changing the conversation that Americans are having around growth and development and the role of government and local government and capital investments. We're really trying to change the cultural conversation about how we build places. I say that's different than 2008. 2008, I was writing to try to figure things out, and I did not realize how much my crazy ideas would resonate with people and where it would all go. But we woke up in somewhere in 2011 or 12, and I say we, myself and the other people that have helped start and get Strong Towns going. We stepped back and said, wow, the effect that we can have here, the golden thing that we are capable of doing is communicating a very complex set of ideas to the broad general public and create room for people who want to reform, people who want to innovate, people who want to change, create room for them to work and accomplish that. And I'm astounded at how successful we've been at it. It's been, 9 years now. I think we're going to have our 10th year anniversary sometime next year. And looking back, it's been kind of crazy, and it shows no sign of the acceleration slowing.
Well, I mean, I think you picked right into that time when we started thinking about things like urbanism and how to make cities work, and your timing was certainly perfect. But I wonder, you guys on some level are a communication vessel, but you guys do other things as well. So where do you guys kind of see yourself fitting in the world of trying to create great places or strong towns?
It's interesting because some of that dabbling in the early days, I come from a consulting background. I worked for an engineering firm for many years, and then I ran my own consulting company for over a decade. And so that was very familiar ground to me. I think in the early days, we kind of dabbled with some of that because people would call with these urgent problems, come and help us with this. And I'd say, well, I can help with that. What we realized is that the more we did that kind of stuff, the less time we had to actually communicate in a broad sense, which was what we were best at. And so today we are a digital media company. We share written columns, we share audio and video stuff, we put together graphic memes, we do a lot of interviews like this and conversations with people. We go around the country and do events where we give lectures and walking tours and different things to help people see their community differently and talk about it in a different way. We use every device we can to share our message. And, that makes us a little bit different than most of the people in this space who are also doing consulting work or white papers or reports or things like that. we're trying to communicate ideas. So we kind of, in some ways take their work and try to magnify it too, especially when it aligns with the message we're trying to get across.
Well, I know that you guys, one of the big things you focus on is data. So, and I think that one of the things you guys do really well is making that data accessible, which is not always something that everyone is good at. So I always appreciate how you're able to translate some of those numbers into to what really matters in the long run.
Thank you. I think there's two things about data, and I think it's important to grasp these too, because backward-looking data is really helpful. It tells you what didn't work. And we can be, in many ways, really confident about what didn't work when we analyze the numbers that we have in front of us. And we can use that information to judge things. In the professional realm, in city building, we hardly ever use backward-looking data to analyze how well we did or how poorly we did. That's just not something we do. Forward-looking is to take current information or, professional projections or what have you, and look out into the future and say, here's what we think is going to happen. And governments do that all the time, and we're horrible at it. And there's no amount of data, there's no amount of information you can gather that is really going to make us better at it over the long term. So when we use data, when we use numbers and information, what we're really doing is trying to help us understand what is working and what is not. But then also give us a little case of, humility when we look at the future and say, all right, here's what we think is going to happen. If we do this, what should the data show in the future? And yeah, I think one of the things we've been able to do is kind of illuminate how, basic numbers, basic information that all cities have. We're just not deploying it very well. And if we do, it's really, really illuminating.
Well, kind of one of my backgrounds is in kind of the hacking world of civic hacking and trying to figure out how to use data in a meaningful way. And that really resonates for me, is to put those numbers out there and see what other people see in them, because I think that only by really exploring the depth of those numbers can we get where we need to go.
Well, and governments have this wealth of information. They have so much at their disposal. And the best of them, and we've seen this trend going for a while, but the best of them have put that stuff out there in the public realm. And what we can see in cities like Seattle, and to an extent the cities like New York, are hackers, people who go grab that, and they have their own question to ask and answer. And they use that information to make things better. And I think the governments that can free themselves up to do that and essentially allow their information and their processes to be exposed to that level of public curiosity and scrutiny are the ones that I think are trending in the right direction. They're the ones that are essentially allowing people to co-build a better place. And I think that that's an exciting shift. I wish all governments would put their raw data sets online. I think it'd be really powerful.
That's really interesting. One of my questions for you that we're kind of getting this to a roundabout way, given that we are this far in and haven't talking about infrastructure stuff, but a lot of the stuff you guys talk about is on that local government level. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about how you think communities can co-build themselves, as you say, where local government is supposed to be involved, where citizenry is supposed to be involved, and how those two play together.
Well, probably the first really core radical insight of Strong Towns is that our development pattern doesn't pay for itself, that our cities are going broke, that the current state of Detroit is actually the future trajectory of most cities in the U.S. Detroit started our current development pattern before everybody else. They became the model that everybody followed after World War II. The Detroit model can be summarized as follows. You take a very productive city and you spread that out over a massive area with the same amount of people or fewer. And what you have is a lot more stuff and a lot less wealth to maintain that stuff. And that works really well for a generation. Another generation, you wind up going into deep debt to keep that going. And then in the third generation, everything just falls apart because you don't have the wealth to take care of it and maintain it all. when we look at our cities today, what we see is that we have had 60, 70 years of massive capital investments to try to create growth, huge projects to spread things out, and chase the dollar out on the edge of town. When we look at these cities, what we see is that the highest returning investments we can make, the things that are most needed, the things that when we spend $1, we get $2, $3, $4 back, are all small investments that are neighborhood focused, that get us back to an incremental kind of traditional development pattern. Little things like planting street trees, putting in crosswalks, narrowing up traffic lanes to slow traffic on a neighborhood street where the kids are playing in the front yard. Little things like that are almost beneath us and our bureaucracies today, almost beneath our imagination today, are really the things that are transformative. So when we look at the people in our cities and we say, how do we co-create this together? What we really are saying is, what can the people out there who are using our city tell us about what needs to be done? And if we just go out and look at them, just go out and observe where people struggle day to day, what we'll see is that there's this overwhelming number of things that need to be done, but they're all small. They're all small. They're all local. They're all very tiny. And our people can help us identify them and in some cases go do them themselves.
So that one of the refrains that we seem to keep coming back to here on the podcast with whoever we talk to is that how do we get input from people and how do we get engagement? So you talk about seeing where people struggle and seeing where the handicaps come into play. Do you have any insight into how best to go about doing that?
Yes. And let me, as is kind of our way, let me tell you what doesn't work, and then I'll tell you what I think the answer is. It's clear that what doesn't work are the things that we're doing now in terms of public hearings and focus groups, and let's have a visioning session, because what you wind up getting is mostly people from affluent places who have spare time to, hire a babysitter or, don't have kids at home because they're retired and they can go and be the people against everything. You get a certain subset of people. And for those people who have done those kind of meetings, you quickly realize that it's the same people at every meeting. What we're suggesting is that the way to actually engage the public is to meet them where they are. To go out and you don't even have to talk to them. I mean, you don't have to even interact with them. You just go out and actually observe what they're doing. Outside my office here, they just replaced the street and I was infuriated. I got really upset with the city and the county because you can see in the ditch on the edge of the street a desire path, a place where people have walked back and forth through the ditch enough to wear a path wear a path down. You can sit here at my desk and look out the window and watch people walking back and forth all day long. Why aren't we fixing that? Why aren't we doing something about that? And not only about that path, but why aren't we, making it a sidewalk? Why aren't we putting in some trees so it's a little bit shadier? Why aren't we, going up to the intersection that they reach and see, look, where do these people go? I've actually done that in this street. Most of the people are walking over to the grocery store. Well, what's that walk like? I mean, you've got to cross a couple nasty streets. Can we slow traffic down a little bit there? Can we make that crossing a little bit shorter? All of a sudden now you're in a mindset where you're not going out and engaging the public in the sense that you're asking them questions that you're comfortable with in a forum you're comfortable with. What you're doing is you're going out in the actual world, watching and observing where people are struggling, and then doing small iterative things to see, hey, does this make things any better for people? That's a lot harder in some ways because it's, you got to get work boots on and it's hot outside sometimes. And sometimes here in Minnesota, it's cold out and, you're going to have to get out from behind the desk. But it's also really empowering because you can actually impact people's lives.
Well, I think one of the other refrains that I keep coming back to with this is that requires a certain humility as well. It requires us to recognize that we don't have the answers necessarily, that what we're taught in school is not necessarily the only way to do things.
I think the humility part is the hardest part of all. And I will admit to struggling with this too, because you don't go into planning, you don't go into engineering with with thinking that, well, I don't know the answers. I mean, you go into those things thinking, I know the answers and I'm going to become even smarter and I'm going to essentially know what to do in all these situations. Cities don't go out and hire planners and engineers because they don't know the answer, right? So even if we don't lack for confidence in these professions. And you can see, especially post-World War II in America, when we had lots of money and affluence and the ability to dream big, the mantra of both these professions is, make no little plans, get out there and think big and build big and transform. The problem is, we not only do we not know what we're doing, not only are we not able to predict or project or fully understand the long-term ramifications of what we do, we actually work in our own bubbles and we ignore the actual lives of people in our community and the things they struggle with. If we can humble ourselves to admit that we don't know what's going to happen a year from now, 5 years from now, 20 years from now, if we can humble ourselves to acknowledge that cities are complex adaptive systems, there's so many things going on that even the best modeling will never capture fully, then we can start to ask a more sophisticated set of questions. And in the words of Nassim Taleb, we can start to incrementally probe the solution. I think his work, The Black Swan and the book Anti-Fragile, have been the most influential on me in terms of grasping the humility needed to actually make big change. We don't know what's going to happen, so we've got to try a bunch of little things and see what sticks and what works, and then continue to iterate. That's how progress throughout all of human history, the progress that is sustainable and viable, that's how it's always been made.
And that I think it's hard as well, because that humility is also required of many different partners. I mean, that you have to, I think of the people particularly, that a lot of this stuff is driven by money in particular places, that you need to have those people in those places have the desire to have the right outcomes, or at least take some of the power out of their hands, perhaps. But well, go ahead. What are your thoughts about that?
No. You just you were talking a little bit about the asymmetry of power, and I think what we've seen in the traditional development pattern is that, the way we used to build cities before the Great Depression, before World War II, before this transformation that we had, and a lot of people point at the automobile, but it's a lot deeper than that. We had a development pattern that, for all its flaws, and there were plenty, was fairly democratic in how it spread out wealth and how it kind of kept things in balance and in check. Post-World War II, what we have done with modern zoning and modern finance, and our ability to invest in highways and frontage roads and things, we've created these enclaves of kind of sorted by wealth. So over here you have the rich neighborhood. It has a berm around it. Over here you have a slightly less rich neighborhood. These are $200,000 houses here. These are 300 here. These are 500 over here. So we've segregated everybody by income. By the style of house they can afford. We've segregated everyone by income into these different lifestyle enclaves. And I think nothing has been more destructive to our social dialogue than that. And, when we create a process that gives the affluent a seat at the table, but really is not responsive to anybody else, I don't think there's any question, the type of input we're going to get. Let's get more input. Let's do more things that benefit the people who live in $500,000 houses, as opposed to those who live in $80,000 houses.
Well, and this kind of feeds into some of the other stuff that you all have talked about in terms of, once that people get to see at the table and they're kind of leading where the investment goes, that actually winds up not putting investment in the best place. That reality is that those investment in those $80,000 house neighborhoods has a much better return on investment than investment in those other neighborhoods.
This was hard for me to come to grips with. And understand, I started out as an engineer building, frontage roads to cul-de-sacs, water systems to the Walmart. I mean, this was what I did, and I didn't do it because I needed the job. I did it because I thought this was making America great. I mean, I thought that these were the things you did to build a successful city, and it was the data, it was the numbers that really drove me in a different direction. And I got to the point where I had run so many models and done so much analysis of our existing development pattern, and I just came to the conclusion that none of this works. I can't find anything that works anywhere. And I was frustrated because people were asking me, well, Chuck, it can't all be bad. Like everything we're doing can't be horrible. And I said, it made me kind of reset and say, okay, what does work? Like what would work? And the only things that I found that would work, like truly where you invest $1 and you get $1 back. Because right now, most of our investments from a local government standpoint, we invest $1, we get 20 cents back. I mean, we get nothing back. We lose money on almost all of these things. It's horrible. The ones that make money are the really small things in poor neighborhoods. Poor neighborhoods. And we, a good friend of mine named Joe Minicozy out of Asheville, North Carolina, we've modeled this over and over and over in hundreds of cities across the country. And what we find is that poor neighborhoods that correlate really high with poverty rates, tend to be older, and they tend to have a much higher rate of tax. So they produce more wealth per acre. They produce higher tax revenues per acre than any other neighborhoods in town. And when you realize that in most of our cities, the poor are subsidizing the affluent, not only is that like a radical slap across the face, but when you go out and look at those poor neighborhoods and you say, well, if we were just Machiavelli and said, let's just soak the poor, like let's extract as much money from the poor as we can, what would you do? Well, you would make strategic investments to make the poor neighborhoods just a little bit better. You'd try to make that $80,000 house into an $85,000 house. And how would you do that? You'd plant some street trees. You'd put out some flowers. You'd put out some benches. You'd fix the sidewalks. You'd fix the street. You'd make it easier to get across the street. You'd get a local store so people could walk to where they're going. You'd make it easier to bike because a lot of people in those neighborhoods don't own cars. You'd start to do things that actually improve the quality of life for people there. So it's this great kind of alignment of the smart thing to do financially is also the good thing to do for humans. And that's kind of a real sweet spot that, once you grasp it, is incredibly powerful.
We'd like to take a moment now to say thank you to our sponsors today. The Urban Affairs and Planning program at Virginia Tech School of Public and International Affairs offers an interdisciplinary approach to understanding planning and policy for megaregions, cities, suburbs, and rural regions in the U.S. and abroad. UAP faculty have expertise in urban planning, architecture, urban design, economics, geography, political science, law, technology, and engineering, and provide students with a multifaceted understanding of how communities grow and change. Students apply their knowledge and professional skills by participating in real-world problem-solving with community clients through project-based studios and applied research. UAP emphasizes technical analysis and policy evaluation in approaching the complexities of modern communities. So big thanks today to the Urban Affairs and Planning program down at Virginia Tech for being our sponsor. If you'd like to hear more, check them out online. But without further ado, we'll get back to today's guest. Thank you. But I think this provides a natural segue into one of the other questions I had, which was you talk a lot about infrastructure from the very beginning. You guys have talked about that. And it's fascinating to me. I think I was in a meeting yesterday where we talked about how infrastructure plays kind of invisible roles on how communities develop. But you guys have been bringing that to the forefront since the very beginning. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about kind of how you came to think of that as so important in this conversation.
Well, I actually started with that. And I started with that because I'm an engineer. I mean, this is what I do. And, a lot of what I did in the engineering days for me was to build that standard municipal stuff, extend the water and sewer out, build the road with the cul-de-sac, help the developer put in the homes. The problem that I ran into is that all these cities that I was working with were growing very robustly, and none of them had any money. They all were experiencing lots of growth, and they could all get their hands on big piles of money to do big things, right? Like we could find the money to build the frontage road. We could find the money to put in a traffic signal or expand the city water tower. But what we couldn't do is keep police and firefighters employed. We couldn't keep the library open past 5 o'clock. There was no money to paint a crosswalk. Those budgets had nothing in them. And my question really started like, why, when these communities are growing, do their taxes go up, their debt goes up, and they don't have any cash? Like it finally occurred to me, like this doesn't make sense. If things were actually working, what we should see in these cities is that taxes go down, right? Quality of life goes up. You'd have money to do all these little things. That was the exact opposite of what I was seeing. And so I started to dig into the numbers. And what I realized is that post-World War II growth has a very clear 3 phases to it. Phase 1 is you get growth. We've become really good at financing that. We borrow money. We get grants from the state, from the federal government. We get developers to come in and pay some of those costs, and then those costs are rolled over into commercial real estate loans and home mortgages. Essentially, someone else pays for the first life cycle of growth. That pipe in the ground, that sidewalk, that street, that's all paid for by somebody else. The local government's not paying hardly anything. If you're the local government and the developer comes in and pays for everything, and then that gets rolled over into mortgages, all of a sudden you have a bunch of taxpayers that cost you nothing. From a cash flow standpoint, you're sitting pretty. You've got a lot of money and you haven't spent a thing for it. Now we get into the second life cycle. So 25, 30 years later, all that stuff needs to be fixed. That road's full of potholes, that sidewalk is cracked, that pipe is settled. You got to go out and fix that. Where's that money come from? Well, it's not coming from the people that were there. It's not coming from the people that infrastructure was built for. Because if you look at they're way spread out. You look at the amount of taxes they're paying compared to the amount of liability you have. It's a tiny fraction of what you need. So you do 2 things. You go out and you get more growth, right? You can get more people to come in at no cost. Then you've got more cash. So there becomes this obsession with growing even faster. And then you go and take on debt. And you convert the little bit of cash you have into debt payments so you can do big projects. You run that out for another generation and you find yourselves with, spread out with way too much liabilities, with everything falling apart, and with tons and tons of debt. And this is why we see a city like Ferguson, Missouri, where a couple summers ago we had the really bad riots and the police altercation for the guys walking on the sidewalks. Or not walking on the sidewalk. You see in a place like Ferguson, they'll pay in a year almost $1 million in interest on their debt, but only have less than $100,000 a year for sidewalk maintenance. So there's a correlation here between this pattern and the general decline that we see growing and growing in cities all across the country. And if we want to do something about it, we have to actually start at the beginning, which is our capital investment approach needs to change.
It's really so fascinating to me because you're coming at all of these issues that a lot of people talk about in terms of wanting to have people close together because walkability is important in terms of climate change, or it's important because that's how you build social capital and that's what we need as a community, or it's important because that's how you overcome segregation. But you're coming at it from a very different angle in that way, and it's fascinating to me that in some ways we wind up in the same place in the end.
I think that is kind of the serendipity of it, because I'm genuinely, it's funny because in the early days I had this group bring me into Chicago, and I'm a conservative guy. I grew up in a small town in conservative part of Minnesota. I still tend to be a fairly conservative person. I've only voted for one Democrat in my entire life. So, if that for your audience gives a sense of like where I'm coming from some of these things. And I had this group that was kind of a left-wing advocacy group of people bring me into Chicago, and they sat me down and they said, "What's the secret message to reach conservatives? Like, we see you doing it. What words do you say? How do you utter it?" And I it was very bewildering to me because I say, I just talk about things the way that I see them. I think I've figured out in years after that if you want to talk to people who are conservative about some of those issues like climate change and like the sense of community and social justice, you have to start with where you share values. And I think strong towns, we've been able to do that. I start where my values are, which is, I care about this city. Why is it going broke? And that conversation leads you to a bunch of these other things, but it's not driven by those other things. And I think that is, one of the differences and really, quite frankly, one of the reasons why our message is kind of universal, why it resonates with a lot of people and people get really excited about it, because we're not here trying to, jam a climate change agenda down your throat using, fancy math to do it. We're here giving you hard facts about your community and then saying, oh, by the way, some of these other things you care about are actually made a little bit easier when you go down this path as well. And, I think that is a more authentic way to go about it. And also, maybe in some ways, a more American way to go about it.
That's it. I love that story. That's just so powerful to me, just the way that communication plays into everything. And when we can sit down and talk through things, how, we can wind up so much more powerful together by actually talking about things from a place of, hey, what do you care about and where does that need to go?
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because, as we've grown, we've had a lot of people who have wanted us to become, their advocacy organization. So, Chuck, why don't you lead with climate change? Why don't you lead with social justice? These are the issues of our time. And, I keep having to go back and say, okay, I'm glad that there's people out there working on those. And I'm glad that there's people out talking about that stuff. I mean, that's important. And I think a Venn diagram of the things you care about and things we care about is going to have some overlap, and let's work on that. But we're not going to be like the organization you want us to be if it's, leading everything with, all these like leftist progressive campaigns. That's not who we are. We're here talking about why your city works, why it doesn't work. And yeah, there's some overlap there. And I hope you find inspiration in the work we do and, can take it and help advance your cause. But I think, when we can stick to the things that I think we all universally agree that our cities need to be financially solvent. That's not really a left or a right issue. We've got to take care of the money or people start to get hurt. And I think everybody agrees on that. And we can use that as like a first principle. A lot of good stuff flows from that.
It's when I think it allows us to have conversations we wouldn't be able to have otherwise. In terms of here in Roanoke, we've had a road that the first iteration of a plan to do something with it. It's kind of a traditional American Main Street that's 4 lanes, 2 in each direction, but the stores are right up on the street. A lot of the stuff that you talk about, it's a really difficult street to walk on. And they came out with a plan that included bike lanes, and it immediately alienated half of the people that were interested in doing anything with that community. And I think the conversation just never got started because there was something politicized about that from the very beginning.
Well, and let me just look at my brief history. I was not a bike lane advocate. I mean, I was an engineer. I built things for cars. Bikes were annoying. Like, why are you in the street? We're trying to move people. Come on, let's get out of the way. And I was really annoyed by it. When I started to look at the math and I started to go through and run numbers and ask these harder questions, I came to the realization that the more people that bike, the cheaper it is for cities. I mean, really, like You look at my downtown here, and there's this obsession over parking. How do we get enough parking? How do we build a parking ramp? How do we rip down some buildings and build some more parking lots? And we've ripped the momentum, we've ripped the life out of our downtown, trying to provide parking. Well, the downtown's 6 blocks from my house. I can walk that, no problem. Why do I need a parking spot? And when you look not just at me, but at everybody else, you realize there's like 10,000 people that live within walking distance of downtown. Why do we need any parking at all? We just need an easy way to walk there. And we can do that much, much cheaper. And so all those parking lots can now become buildings, which are great because that's even more stuff to go to. So you actually get to a point where, I mean, I bike all over the place now. I think driving my car is ridiculously stupid because when I drive my car, I got to pay for gas. I have to sit and wait. I ride my bike. I get to where I'm going more quickly. I feel great. And it costs me a lot less money. A friend of mine, a guy who's now running for mayor of Seattle named Mike McGinn, has this great line, and I use it a lot. I want to attribute it to him, though. He says, I don't bike because I'm green. I bike because I'm cheap. And I bike because I'm cheap. And I think like most cities should be, cheap places that cater to cheap people. That's a pretty like frugal, prudent way to build a really strong country.
I love that. Well, as we kind of get towards the end here, I wonder if you could share a bit about what you think a strong town or a thriving place or a strong community looks like, or what are the components that make it up in your mind?
I think that there's a couple that come to mind. The first one, and I think the most important one, is that you have active citizenry. You have people actually out working at the block level, at the neighborhood level, and I don't mean filling their own potholes. I mean just like chatting with each other, talking. If you don't have an ongoing community dialogue that is not artificial, something's wrong, right? If you have to have like an artificial, let's everybody gather at this place and talk about things. Let's everybody have a day in the park where we all get together. Those things should be happening spontaneously at the block level all the time, all over the place. And that's the greatest indicator that things are working, is when you have the network of intellectual collaboration between people who care about their place going on outside of any artificial thing. Hey, the train's going by. I don't know if you can hear that or not, but that's the one like ambiance thing about this studio here is I'm like 20 feet from a train track. So when the train goes by, I think, one other component would be a government that is as downward facing instead of upward facing. So instead of a government that is at the city level, that's oriented towards the state programs and the federal programs and all the ways we can get money from the state and federal government and Wall Street, is actually oriented towards its people, saying, what can we do with the stuff we've got right now? How do we incrementally help make things better? What do our people actually need? I think those communities are in a better position. And then the third one, I think, just places that embrace information. We sometimes get overwhelmed with data and overwhelmed with information. And I'm not just talking about collecting, data for the sake of it. But I'm suggesting cities that ask tough questions, then go and get information that either proves or disproves whatever their theory is, and then iterates again, essentially employs the scientific process at the local level. Here's what we think should happen if we're doing this right. Here's what actually did happen. And then here's our updated theory. I think cities that can systematically do that, iteration after iteration, day after day, week after week, I think those are going to be the ones that are the strongest in the end, are the best positioned.
I completely agree. I think with all of those things. So very good to hear. Now, I'm sure it's been a kind of a process to come to that point where those are kind of the three things that you think, and you shared about some of your difficulty, especially perhaps with the stuff about the poorest neighborhoods being the best place to invest and things like that. Like, so I wonder if you could share kind of what one of the biggest things that you've learned through this process has been.
I mean, in one word, it's been humility, and particularly humility about the future. I think there's a sense, and I'm guilty of this too. So I have to be careful with myself. There's a sense that, when you are a smart person and you're well read and you've got a college degree and you've got initials behind your name that say you've got a license, people look to you and say, well, you know what to do, obviously, right? And I think it's very seductive to fall into the trap of, yeah, I know what to do. Here's what should be done. And I think the bigger the system, the more seductive that is. If you can build the next big bridge or the next big stadium or what have you, it's a very seductive way to go about things. They don't write. We don't remember Julius Caesar and Augustus because they got the sewer system to work, right? We don't remember them because they put in some street trees. Remember them because of the huge things that they built that are still there that, people talk about and have talked about for years. So there's this seductiveness of the big. And I think when we look to the future, having the humility that we actually don't know what is going to happen. And, we don't know, despite our best efforts and our best thinking of ourselves and our own capabilities, the past is littered with all kinds of people who thought they knew something and were wrong. And so if we can just approach the future with a little bit of humility, it doesn't mean we become powerless. In fact, I think it means we become more powerful. We actually learn to iterate and to probe that uncertainty in a much stronger, much more confident kind of way. It's a real confidence instead of a false confidence. So humility is the hardest lesson that I've had to learn. And I think it's the hardest lesson that our local governments and professionals need to learn too, if they want to get on the right track.
Well, it's again, I just love that, and it's such a shame. I think that we have to cut it short now. But could you share kind of a story from your experience that can kind of wrap this all together and share what you think how cities should work or how towns should work?
If we had 2 more hours, yeah. I think I'm an engineer and I'm a planner. I said at the very beginning that I played drums in a band, and I did, and I love music and I love art, but I wouldn't call myself like an artist. I'm certainly not. You won't find me hanging out in the coffee shops, doing the things that artists do. I'm a homebody. I'm a conservative engineer. I'm a little bit of a prude, right? Like I deal with sidewalks and curbs and numbers. I mean, that's my realm. So I'm in this small town, and I'm walking around, and I'm trying to figure things out. I'm trying to learn, and all over the place I see just what I think you just call like guerrilla street art. Nothing that is sanctioned, nothing that's like a David in Florence or anything like that. You see like the utility boxes painted. The electric company comes in and just mindlessly places these boxes all over the place and just makes everything look ugly. People have gone out and painted like little things on them. You see these stickers stuck on the light poles, just little like art all over the place. And it took me a while to step back and actually look at it. But what I realized is that this one city had so much like love going on, and people who just were like overflowing with the desire to make the place look a little bit better, that people were out just kind of hacking it themselves. And as I got to know the city a little bit better, what I found is that the more opportunity you gave for people to come out and kind of co-create the space, the more that love and that artistry and that passion really came to the fore. As I started then to look at cities of the past, going back to Europe where they didn't destroy their cities, they kept them, but also then looking at places here in the U.S. that retain some of that. What I found is that there was this kind of universal great artistry to it. when you travel a city at 2 miles an hour instead of 30 miles an hour, it gives a lot of room and a lot of time to not only express yourself, but to take in that expression of others. And so you see that carpentry, which today is about pounding nails and keeping, things level, back then was really about artistry. And masonry, which today is about, pouring floors and keeping things flat and sloping water away, back then was a deep, deep artistry. And you realize that, we're an artistic species. We do this, and even someone like me, who is very much in the engineering numbers realm, can also appreciate in a way this kind of deep embedded artistry in our day-to-day operations. This is how we are created, and I think we've denied ourselves that in many ways. Our public realm is largely brutal. It's largely ugly. It's largely despotic. I think when we can allow that natural beauty and artistry created by human hands to start to creep back into these places, they become spectacular and they become worth living in and worth loving. And that really is the bar we have to clear. Are our places worth loving? Because if they are, we'll take care of them.
What a powerful message to end on there. Thank you so much, Chuck. And if you guys like what Chuck has to say, check him out at strongtowns.org, and you can see some of the great information on there. It's a consistent source for many of us here in the CityWorks Expo world. And check us out at cityworksexpo.com. But thank you again, Chuck, for being with us today.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Big Ideas for Better Places podcast today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe and leave a rating. It really helps other people find out about our fascinating guests and find the information that we have to share. Lastly, please save the date for our upcoming event, October 5th through 7th in Roanoke, Virginia. And keep up to date by following us on Facebook and checking out our website, cityworksexpo.com. That's cityworksexpo.com. Thank you guys again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.